The bustle of the Athenian street was a relentless symphony. Merchants hawked their wares, slaves clattered past carrying baskets of goods, and wealthy citizens, wrapped in fine robes, discussed matters of state with gestures that seemed to take up all the available air. Yet, amid this vibrant, chaotic flow of life, one young student paused. His attention snagged on a question so vast it felt impossible to contain. What was the meaning of life? It wasn't a simple inquiry about politics or trade. It was a piercing intellectual demand, a search for the fundamental purpose that underpinned all human effort. He stood there, an island of quiet contemplation in a sea of urgent activity. The crowd swept around him, oblivious to the profound nature of his stillness. For the first time, he realized that this question, though so universal, remained frustratingly undefined by those who surrounded him. To live meant simply existing. To thrive implied some discernible goal or ultimate reward. Was it fame? Wealth? Pleasure? He watched these immediate assumptions play out in the lives around him. The desperate bargaining over a pittance of silver, the joyous spectacle of an athletic victory, the careful maintenance of elaborate social appearances. Yet none of these things provided genuine stillness for his inner turmoil. The answers he heard echoed off the passing columned buildings. Follow the law, build a great empire, acquire more property. These were all valid human endeavors, certainly, but they felt like temporary distractions from some core truth. He began to feel the weight of this undefined pursuit settle upon his shoulders. The intellectual challenge was not merely academic. It demanded a reevaluation of every assumption he had ever held about success and value. He walked further into the heart of the city's marketplace, a place designed for commerce and exchange, but which suddenly felt like a stage set purely for misdirected desires. He observed men who were ostensibly successful. Their togas were clean, their lines firm with authority, and they moved with the self-assurance of those who had achieved something great. But as he watched them, an unexpected sense of hollowness began to prick at his awareness. Their confidence seemed brittle, their gaiety often forced. It struck him that perhaps these visible markers of a life well lived were merely superficial coatings disguising a deep, internal void. The initial assumption had been that goodness resided in the outer sphere, in public accolades, material accumulation, or skilled performance. But his growing intuition suggested the opposite, that if the emptiness lay beneath the surface, then true meaning must reside within the structure of the self. He felt a rising sense of intellectual frustration mixed with exhilarating anticipation. To answer this question required not just observation, but profound and uncomfortable excavation. He needed to understand what it meant to genuinely know oneself. The Athenian street provided all sorts of temporary answers, the promise of gold, the fleeting high of admiration, the comfort of routine repetition, but none of them offered the lasting substance he sought. He understood that if he wished to solve this deep philosophical mystery, he could not rely on the hurried pronouncements of strangers or the passing spectacle of market life. The path ahead required a rigorous journey inward, an intellectual confrontation with his own unchallenged assumptions about what constitutes a good and meaningful existence. The streets of Athens had taught him much about the noise of existence. He had learned that many people possessed strong opinions, yet those opinions were built on shifting sand. Every person he met offered a definitive answer to the great question, what it means to live well. One man declared that wealth was the key. Another insisted that reputation was the highest good. Perhaps pleasure defined a life of success. These confident declarations sounded solid, weighty with certainty. But in the quiet solitude after each conversation, a creeping doubt would return, like a tide pulling away from certain shores. He realized that these answers were not true definitions. They were merely comforting illusions, useful for keeping the mind busy but incapable of delivering genuine fulfillment. He remembered the dialogues, the bright, confident voices arguing their cases in the agora. Each theory was presented with conviction, seemingly providing a solid map for human existence. But the experience had shown him that maps, no matter how detailed, fail to capture the territory itself. The joy promised by accumulating riches felt transient, vanishing like smoke upon open air. The admiration earned through public accolades provided only the temporary warmth of applause, leaving behind a chill when the crowd dispersed. He struggled with this fundamental misunderstanding, mistaking external validation for internal truth. His mind became an echo chamber of competing philosophies. Should he value the honor bestowed by his peers or the simple quietude of self-knowledge? The conflict grew deep within him. Was goodness a possession to be acquired, like fine silks or polished bronze? Or was it something inherent, waiting only for illumination? He felt suspended between two worlds, the vibrant, demanding world of public expectation, and the silent, echoing chasm of his own inner questioning. He began to question the very foundation of these popular beliefs. What if happiness was not a destination arrived at through material achievement, but rather a steady state of the mind? This contemplation was exhausting, requiring him to sift through layers of cultural assumption and inherited wisdom. It felt like trying to cup smoke in his hands, effortful, frustrating, yet captivating nonetheless. The weight of this unresolved tension led him back to the quiet understanding that had initially stirred within him. The answers he sought must not be found beyond himself. They could not be purchased, nor could they be forced through public displays of virtue or power. If true meaning required external pursuit, it was inherently unstable. Therefore, the answer had to be something portable, something resilient enough to withstand the pressures and changes of Athenian life. The dusty streets of Athens had always been a stage for spectacle and debate. For days now, the young seeker walked through this intellectual chaos, carrying the weight of an enormous question. What is the meaning of life? He had already faced polished pronouncements from friends and scholars, answers about success measured by gold, or happiness promised by reputation. Yet every answer felt hollow upon closer examination, like a beautiful song played without melody. He realized that believing in these easy external answers was simply a form of intellectual comfort. They required little effort, no self-examination, only agreement. The true path, he sensed, lay not beyond the city walls or within the accumulated treasures of men, but deep inside the guarded chamber of his own mind. This internal journey felt terrifyingly exposed. To look inward was to confront the messy residue of one's unexamined habits, the compromises made in public life for temporary pleasure. He felt a rising anxiety, an urge to retreat to the comforting superficiality of accepting prepackaged truths. But then, from the corner of the marketplace, he saw him, a figure who moved with an unexpected, almost casual gravity. This was Socrates. He did not stride into view with pronouncements or definitive wisdom. Instead, he approached the seeker with a simple curiosity in his eyes. Socrates did not offer an answer to the great question of life's meaning. Instead, he offered something far more challenging, conversation itself. It was a methodology, a gentle yet relentless pressure applied to the soft tissues of assumed knowledge. This process, which the seeker would come to call elentious, felt initially like a direct assault on his intelligence. He expected confrontation. Instead, he received careful questioning. The early interactions were frustrating. The student tried to define virtues, courage, justice, piety, with the precision of an academic essay. He constructed logical frameworks, listing premises and conclusions. But Socrates would merely nod, then ask a small shift in perspective. If the seeker defined courage as standing against fear, Socrates might gently press him. But what about fearing for one's family? Is that bravery or calculated risk? The student found himself trapped in webs of his own definitions. His certainty began to unravel with surprising speed. He saw how his initial understanding was narrow, incomplete, and built upon faulty assumptions gleaned from others. It was not a reprimand. It was an intellectual excavation. Socrates did not aim to prove the man wrong, but rather to show him that the man had never fully understood what he thought he knew. The process required painful humility. This gentle challenge chipped away at the armor of the ego. The seeker realized that for much of his life, he had prioritized appearing knowledgeable over actually knowing. He valued sounding thoughtful more than being genuinely reflective. This realization was a profound blow, yet it felt strangely liberating. It meant the true journey had just begun. The questioning became less about specific definitions and more about alignment. Socrates began to draw a contrast between what one merely believed and what one truly understood. He pointed out that accepting a truth because it is widely held did not make it true for the individual soul. Wisdom, he suggested, must be earned through self-doubt. The weight of this Socratic method was immense. It forced the student to confront the vastness of ignorance. The deeper he went in inquiry, the more aware he became of how little he actually knew. This state, the knowledge of one's own unknowing, became its own form of profound insight. It dissolved the brittle confidence that had been his shield. He began to understand that true wisdom was not a lofty, unattainable prize held by philosophers or kings. It was merely the steadfast commitment to persistent doubt. It was asking why, not once but perpetually. The gentle challenge was not meant to break him, but to refine him, to burn away the superfluous layers of assumption, until only the foundational truth remained. That self-knowledge is the sole starting point for any meaningful life. The pursuit, therefore, shifted from finding a fixed answer about the good life to mastering the internal landscape. The dialogue became a reflection on how one ought to live in accordance with reason and virtue, not merely adhering to social convention or external reward. He started seeing that virtue was not a collection of good actions. It was a state of knowing, a harmonious alignment between thought, feeling, and moral action. This clarity provided the first steady anchor in the storm of philosophical pursuit. The search for meaning had led him far from the bright marketplace of Athens, taking him into a deeper chamber of thought. All previous answers, the glittering promise of empire, the steady comfort of accumulating wealth, the intoxicating rush of public praise, had proven merely reflections on a still pool, failing to reveal the true depth below. He found himself standing at an intellectual crossroads, confronted by the persistent echo of questions that had no easy reply. The wisdom imparted was not meant to be a comforting formula. It was a stark illumination. It demanded a reckoning with illusion. Imagine, if you will, men chained in a subterranean cavern. Their world is limited by the flickering light cast upon the wall before them. They believe these shadows are reality, the true shapes of things, the very essence of life and virtue. They have never known sun, nor the sky above their heads. This is the great challenge. Recognizing that what we take for truth may be nothing more than a projection, a mere shadow cast by our own ignorance or the prevailing whims of society. For too long, He had accepted these imposed shadows, the necessity of appearing rich to be considered valuable, the certainty that reputation equals virtue, without ever questioning the source of the light or the nature of the chains themselves. The revelation is painful because it requires a violent rupture with comfort. It compels us to turn away from the familiar darkness and face the blinding, unfiltered glare of genuine reality. To ascend toward the light is not merely an intellectual exercise. It is a profound act of spiritual anguish. The ascent demands abandoning all previously held certainties, for those certainties are built upon unstable ground, the comfortable myths we tell ourselves to avoid the hard work of self-knowledge. This realization led him back to the original source of wisdom, not in dusty scrolls or grand pronouncements, but in a focused moment of intense internal scrutiny. Socrates' teaching had shifted the entire premise of the good life. It was never something found outside the individual, waiting for discovery. It was something constructed within through discipline and relentless questioning. The deepest commodity, he came to understand, is not gold or glory, but disciplined understanding. He began to see that every failure to live examinedly, every acceptance of a platitude, every moment spent chasing fleeting approval was merely another indulgence in the cave's shadows. These actions did not define him. His inner disposition did. The true weight and measure of a person resided in the quality of their judgments and the freedom of their internal assent. The good life, therefore, is not about achieving happiness, for happiness itself remains a fleeting state like shifting sands. It is not about maximizing pleasure, which inevitably leads to decline. Rather, it is about cultivating self-mastery, a constant vigilance over one's own mind, ensuring that nothing external can dictate the quality of one's soul. The pursuit became less of an answer and more of a state of being, a continuous commitment to inquiry itself. The worthiest life was the examined life, the one lived with intellectual humility, recognizing always that one knows so little. To ask the necessary question, even when it causes discomfort or social friction, is inherently superior to accepting any prefabricated answer. This unwavering focus shifted his goal from finding the definition of virtue to becoming relentlessly attuned to the process by which virtue might be understood and practiced. This new understanding brought a quiet dignity to his steps. The external pressures of Athens, the need to appear successful, the craving for accolades, retained their shine, but they no longer possessed the transformative power they once held. They were simply objects viewed through a newly cleared lens. He learned to observe others, noting how passionately people defended their beliefs in shadows, their pursuit of status, their devotion to material accumulation, their fear of admitting ignorance. Yet this observation was no longer judgmental, it was merely diagnostic. He understood that their unhappiness was not caused by external loss or misfortune, but by the very dependence upon those external goods for defining self-worth. They built mansions of belief on shifting sand. The wisest among them remained perpetually searching, always reminding themselves to look inward, away from the dazzling but deceptive walls of the cave, toward the true, uncompromising light. The murmurs of the Athenian street seemed to grow distant, muffled by a realization that was more profound than any crowd noise. All this time, the quest for meaning had been approached as an external search, a treasure hidden in some grand temple or acclaimed scroll. But Socrates' gentle questioning had revealed something far stranger. The deepest truths were not found among the laurels of praise, nor within the gold piled high in the market square. They resided, instead, within the delicate architecture of the mind itself. He thought back to the weight of what he had learned, the illusion of external fulfillment. Wealth provided temporary satisfaction, but it could never fill the void left by unexamined existence. Reputation offered a fleeting echo, an applause that quickly faded into silence. Even pleasure, which seemed so immediate and tangible, proved itself merely a distraction from the deeper call to self-awareness. The true battleground, he now understood, was not on the political stage of Athens, but in the quiet, often resistant chambers of his own thoughts. A monumental shift occurred when the concept of virtue began to settle into place. It was not portrayed as an external gift bestowed by gods or achieved through mere happenstance. Instead, it took on a startling definition. Virtue is knowledge. This meant that true goodness is fundamentally a matter of understanding. If you genuinely know what is right and truly understand how human nature operates in its highest form, then acting according to that understanding becomes inescapable. One cannot willfully choose injustice if one genuinely possesses the perfect knowledge of justice. This realization carried a weight, both exhilarating and terrifying. It implied responsibility. It suggested that moral failure was not necessarily a moral weakness of character alone, but often stemmed from a fundamental lack of understanding, a mistaken premise or a clouded judgment regarding what truly benefits the soul. To be unjust, therefore, risked being ignorant. To live poorly risked simply misunderstanding the highest good. This was an intellectual burden far heavier than any bronze cuirass. Yet this realization offered profound liberation. It reframed the entire quest for meaning. The goal shifted from acquiring a perfect state of virtue, which might seem impossible, to relentlessly cultivating the knowledge that supports it. The virtuous life did not require effortless perfection. It demanded rigorous self-correction and unending inquiry into one's own faulty assumptions. He recalled Socrates teaching him to scrutinize his deepest convictions, forcing him to trace the logical lineage of concepts like courage or piety. These were not simple definitions, but complex webs of interconnected judgments. Courage was not merely fighting in battle. It required knowing when and why fear was misplaced. Piety was not simply ritualistic observance. It demanded understanding the genuine connection between human action and cosmic order. The wisdom he sought now seemed to reside in this intellectual vigilance. It meant recognizing that every casual judgment, every unexamined belief whispered into the quiet moments before sleep, held the potential to diminish the quality of his soul. This required a kind of continuous internal dialogue, a permanent mentor speaking only to him. He had to treat his own mind as the most valuable territory to be governed, purifying it from the debris of assumption and societal habit. This concept meant that wisdom was not an accumulated cache of facts, but rather a skill set, the ability to question assumptions, to trace definitions back to first principles, and to withstand the shock of one's own ignorance. He looked at the bustling life around him, at merchants loudly boasting their wares, or citizens arguing vehemently over policy, and saw it all through this new lens. They were not simply living. They were operating on layers of inherited misunderstanding. The path forward thus became clear. The good life is a disciplined life of knowledge. It requires treating understanding as an active verb, something that must be applied and tested daily. If one truly understands what is good for the soul, that is, rationality, temperance, justice, then acting wisely becomes the natural outflow of that superior intellect. Desire, therefore, is not the master. Understanding is. The struggle against ignorance became the essence of self-mastery. This framework demanded acceptance of imperfection in the journey itself. There would be days when clarity slipped away, when old habits of judgment rushed back like a tide. But the knowledge that virtue was attainable through learning provided the anchor. It gave him not false hope, but sustainable effort, the commitment to think better tomorrow than he thought today. To live well was simply to know how to reason correctly, and the rigorous practice of reason was all the answer truly required. The greatest gift was not an understanding of the cosmos, but a deep respect for the sheer power of self-correction. The journey to understanding the good life had proven itself to be a profound excavation. It was not a treasure chest buried beneath Athens, nor was it a fixed city on the horizon that awaited discovery. After facing the illusions of reputation and wealth, after confronting the shadows of accepted truth, I realized that all conventional external markers failed to sustain genuine contentment. My gaze had shifted entirely inward, becoming restless, seeking the source of true human worth. The rigorous dialogue with Socrates taught me an invaluable lesson. Most perceived ignorance is simply a resistance to deep self-examination. The comfortable beliefs we cling to are often merely habits of thought, unchallenged, until a persistent question dismantles them. We mistake inherited assumption for solid knowledge, accepting the world's clamor as ultimate reality. This intellectual labor required more than mere listening. It demanded a commitment to radical honesty with oneself. It meant dismantling the curated self, the roles we play for our families, our tribes, or our city. To truly live was to become relentlessly curious about one's own operating principles. What do I believe? Why do I believe it? And if that belief proves false, how will I adapt? The deepest struggle became internal, shifting the battleground from the public square to the mind's quiet chambers. The mastery of inner dialogue is not a sudden enlightenment. It is a constant act of arbitration. It is learning to pause between stimulus and reaction, recognizing the gap where judgment resides. That small space is the arena where freedom resides. Desires bubble up, the craving for applause, the anxiety over potential failure, the sticky comfort of routine certainty. These desires are not inherently evil, but when they become the sole architects of our decisions, they enslave us. We mistake emotional fulfillment for ethical living. This chapter taught me that most of human unhappiness is merely poor management of one's own judgments. The external world continues its relentless pursuit, the dazzling spectacle of luxury goods, the urgent whisper of political praise. I watch them, seeing people chasing success not because they understand virtue, but because it feels powerful, tangible, and immediately rewarding. And yet, beneath the veneer of accomplishment, there is a brittle emptiness, a hollow echo that wealth can never fill. The true difficulty lies in separating what happens to us from how we judge what happens to us. The event itself, the harsh word, the unexpected loss, the failure of an enterprise is simply neutral data. It carries no intrinsic moral weight. It is our story about the event, our judgment about its meaning and its consequence, that determines whether we fall into despair or rise with resilience. This realization marked a profound shift in my practical existence. If suffering stems from flawed judgment, then wisdom becomes synonymous with the rigorous correction of those judgments. We must learn to question not only external claims, like this life is meaningful only if you are rich, but also our own internal convictions. If I fail this test, it means I am unworthy. The mastery requires patience. It demands a sustained, daily conversation with oneself, one that treats every assumption as provisional and every reaction as suspect. It is the ongoing process of refining character through principled self-scrutiny. Therefore, the good life, according to this deepening understanding inspired by Socrates, is not about reaching an external state or acquiring specific goods. It is fundamentally a disciplined way of thinking, a commitment to the unexamined consciousness. It is the continuous, tireless practice of aligning one's deepest beliefs with reason and virtue. To live well is simply to think correctly, consistently, and courageously, even when that thought path leads away from comfort, prestige, or immediate gratification. The greatest achievement, I now understand, is not what we build in stone, but the inner citadel of our disciplined mind. The marketplace of Athens was a riot of motion and meaningless chatter. Here and there, voices rose in boastful declarations, speeches about silver mines, armies conquered, or pleasures anticipated. The protagonist watched these crowds, recognizing the pattern. Men obsessed with what they could gain or display. They moved through life driven by external metrics, convinced that happiness was a treasure waiting to be acquired from the world. Yet, deep down, observing their haste and occasional flash of emptiness, a profound disquiet settled over him. He saw them chasing shadows, the fleeting applause, the momentary indulgence, the promise of future glory. These pursuits promised satisfaction, but only delivered an ephemeral craving that demanded more, always more. It was a treadmill of desire fueled by more. He recalled Socrates' teachings in his mind. The wisdom he had gained taught him to distrust any definition of the good life rooted outside oneself. If wealth provided happiness, why were the richest men often consumed by anxiety or despair? If reputation guaranteed worth, why did public praise vanish with the turning tide of fickle opinion? These questions formed a persistent echo within his own mind, challenging the foundations upon which Athenian society seemed to build its definition of success. He saw people who lived lives lauded by their neighbors, but were profoundly unfulfilled when they finally retreated into the solitude of their homes. The gap between appearance and reality was vast and haunting. This observation forced a painful internal reckoning. Was true fulfillment achievable through any external mechanism? Did virtue truly reside in owning more, or merely in knowing better? He began to observe specific examples. A wealthy merchant whose life seemed perfect from the outside, yet whose eyes held a perpetual weariness. A celebrated orator whose eloquent speeches masked deep inner fear. These contradictions were not mere anomalies. They appeared to be systemic failures of reliance. They showed that anchoring one's sense of self-worth or happiness to external goods was not only fragile but fundamentally illogical. The struggle shifted from what life was to where the meaning of life actually resided. If virtue is knowledge, and happiness is achieved through reason, then the locus of good living must be internal. But how do you prove that? How do you convince a bustling city, filled with glittering temptations and loud declarations, that stillness and introspection are worth more than gold or glory? The challenge was no longer theoretical. It became an anthropological observation of human failing. He realized that much of the contemporary struggle for meaning was merely external validation sickness. People were constantly performing happiness for an imagined audience, mistaking outward success for inner peace. They wore masks of contentment while living lives dictated by others' expectations. The expectation to acquire, the expectation to achieve, the expectation to appear flawlessly successful. The protagonist understood that Socrates was guiding him not just toward a definition, but toward a deep suspicion of all those definitions. The goal wasn't finding an answer like justice or courage or piety. The goal was recognizing that these concepts must be self-sustaining, that their value could not be revoked by the market, lost in battle, or shouted down by rivals. He walked through a section of the agora, watching young men posturing. one youth, decked out in expensive dyed robes and carrying an impressive scroll case, stopped suddenly, laughing loudly at something unseen. His laughter was bright, brittle, and seemed utterly unsupported. He watched the boy's shoulders slump moments later. The facade dropped, revealing a sudden vulnerability that contradicted his earlier bravado. This sequence played out repeatedly throughout the day, the forced display of energy, the momentary collapse into private fatigue. It struck him with the force of undeniable evidence. These emotional swings were dictated by external circumstances and internal inadequacies, not by genuine inner fortitude. This constant witnessing solidified a radical truth. That true joy was not an outcome contingent upon achieving some external status, but rather a byproduct of maintaining integrity within one's own judgments. The person who genuinely understood what was truly good, that the careful calibration of reason and ethical judgment mattered more than any visible possession, lived with a quiet confidence that defied the cacophony around him. It was not the loudest voice or the grandest robe that signaled this understanding, but a settled quality of mind. The profound realization here was that happiness is a self-regulating system, nourished by rational thought and virtuous action. When one begins to measure life, not by the applause of strangers, but by the consistency between one's reasoned beliefs and one's actions, a process he had learned through rigorous self-examination, the external noise fades into irrelevance. The crowd may build empires or scatter fortunes, but they cannot touch the citadel of a disciplined mind. He resolved that his journey needed to pivot away from mere philosophy toward existential practice. To truly understand Socrates' definition of the good life, he could not just argue about it, he had to live it. He saw the relentless chase for external validation, the accumulation of goods, the craving for praise, the desperate need to define oneself by another person's approval, not as human nature itself, but as a deeply ingrained habit of flawed judgment. And like any habit, it could be undone, one careful thought at a time. The good life, he concluded, was not something found in Athens. It was built within the quiet, deliberate structure of a self-examined soul. Having spent weeks traversing the marketplaces and sun-drenched plazas of Athens, the restless quest for meaning had finally narrowed its focus. It was clear that the good life could not be purchased with coins, nor earned through fleeting acts of glory. It resided within the self, within the careful structures of reason itself. Yet, knowing where to look was far different from actually finding it. The rigorous process of questioning had forced an intellectual humility upon him, a deep and unsettling recognition that he knew nothing at all. This powerful void of ignorance became paradoxically the starting point for true knowledge. He sought out Socrates once more, not expecting revelations, but perhaps another round of gently guided self-interrogation. They settled into a quiet alcove near the agora, a place where the noise of commerce muffled slightly, allowing their dialogue to take center stage. Today's conversation would be different. It could no longer merely challenge abstract ideas. It needed to define things concrete and fundamental, things like justice, courage, and the meaning of mere existence itself. The air felt heavy with anticipation, a weight only lifted by the purity of philosophical inquiry. Socrates began not by defining these virtues for him, but by peeling away his initial assumptions about them. He approached justice as if it were an object on a pedestal, asking what it truly entailed. Was it simply law adherence? Is it merely paying debts? The dialogue was intricate and relentless, a gentle siege against every preconceived notion he held. He found that the more he clung to easy definitions, the neat little boxes of understanding, the more quickly Socrates would poke them open until they crumbled into dust. This wasn't an attack on him personally. It was merely an effort to dismantle his fragile certainty, forcing him back to the elemental state of knowing nothing, except the process of questioning itself. The weight of understanding had settled upon him. After years spent chasing external definitions, the glint of gold, the roar of the crowd's applause, the sweet promise of immediate pleasure, he now felt an almost profound emptiness. All those elaborate systems of value built by Athenian society crumbled beneath the relentless pressure of reason. He realized that wisdom was not a scroll to be acquired or a monument to be erected. It was something far more fragile and demanding. It was internal discipline itself. The conversations with Socrates had systematically dismantled his certainty, teaching him that he knew nothing and that self-examination was its own reward. Yet, knowledge brought a daunting new problem. If the good life was purely about reason and virtue, where did one draw the line? Where did the control of the inner spirit end and the chaos of the external world begin? He found himself observing the market square again, but this time his attention was different. He watched people making decisions, trading their time for coin or sacrificing comfort for reputation. The actions themselves seemed driven by a fundamental misunderstanding of where true power resided. They believed control lay in possessions, yet those very possessions were subject to accident, theft, and the whims of fortune. They grasped for stability in things that flowed like water, always changing. The profound lesson began to coalesce around an invisible boundary, the dividing line between what we can command within our own souls and what must simply be received from fate. He was forced to distinguish between two spheres, one composed entirely of his judgments, his desires, his voluntary responses, the other encompassing everything else, his physical health, the actions of others, the political outcome of a city, or even death itself. The mental effort required to maintain this separation felt exhausting, yet it was also incredibly liberating. The previous struggle had been one of doing things correctly, being the best orator, acquiring the finest cloak, winning the public favor. Now, the fight shifted entirely inward. It became a commitment not just to know what is virtuous, but to accept the limits of one's own power. This realization was not merely academic theory. It offered immediate psychological grounding. If he understood that his peace of mind depended only on how he interpreted events, on the judgment he placed upon them, then vast swaths of anxiety suddenly lost their purchase. The clamor of fear, the pangs of regret over things undone or said, all stemmed from a mistaken belief in his capacity to control the uncontrollable. The truly free life, we realized, was not one that dictated external circumstances, but one characterized by perfect emotional detachment concerning those circumstances. It required acknowledging acceptance for everything beyond the citadel of the self. The storm raging outside, be it political upheaval or personal disappointment, could buffet him entirely, yet his core state remained untouched if he understood the boundary. He started to practice this separation with deliberate intention. When a setback occurred, instead of immediately spiraling into despair or anger at fate, he would pause. He would ask, is this pain caused by my failure in judgment? Or is it caused by external reality? This simple inquiry was a revolutionary act of self-sovereignty. By claiming ownership only over his own assent, he reclaimed his psychological power entirely. The acceptance required here was not passive resignation. It was an active, muscular refusal to waste energy wishing things were other than they are in this moment, simply because other felt safer or more desirable. It demanded rigorous engagement with reality as it presented itself, recognizing that resistance only created a secondary source of suffering. The good life, therefore, crystallized into a single, breathtaking formula. Virtue, which is living according to reason, combined with acceptance, which is acknowledging the limits of one's influence. He saw that striving for external happiness was an endless trap because it rested on faulty premises. The premise that success guarantees joy, or that approval grants worth. True contentment emerged only when he stopped treating chance and fate as personal affronts, instead seeing them as neutral raw material upon which his virtuous judgments could safely operate. This deep understanding did not erase struggle. If anything, it reframed it. Failure was no longer a condemnation of self, but simply an event to be judged rationally. Criticism was not an assault on his character, but merely an observation from another mind, requiring thoughtful consideration rather than reactive defensiveness. The ability to withstand the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, without letting them compromise internal peace, that became the ultimate measure of a well-lived life. He felt a profound shift in demeanor. He moved through Athens not with aggressive intellectual fervor, but with a quiet gravity. His confidence was no longer loud or boastful. It was a deeply rooted stillness. It was the calm assurance of someone who had successfully navigated the most treacherous territory, the internal landscape of the mind, and found its true geometry. The ultimate freedom, he concluded, lay not in changing the world around him, but in mastering the sacred space between his ears. The theory was beautiful, yet it remained trapped in the lecture halls and quiet contemplation. It was a magnificent scaffold of reason built upon years of painstaking self-interrogation. But philosophy, by its very nature, is abstract. It exists first as words on papyrus, or as concepts debated under an Athenian sun, and a concept does not become wisdom until it is tested against the friction of real life. The true test did not arrive in an academic debate. It arrived unexpectedly, unannounced, and with a profound sense of public failure. One morning, after weeks of internal struggle, balancing the lofty ideals of virtue against the messy reality of human imperfection, the protagonist faced a situation that demanded immediate action, devoid of time for careful deliberation. The challenge was not theoretical. It involved judging another person's character in a critical moment, a choice requiring judgment regarding loyalty, integrity, and practical compassion. The old reflex surged forward, pulling him toward the familiar comfort of reactive emotion, defensive anger, sharp criticism, or perhaps a calculated retreat into emotional numbness. He stopped himself. He watched the visceral surge of instinct attempting to derail his carefully constructed philosophy. This was the gap between knowing the correct answer and actually choosing it under pressure. It demanded more than mere intellectual agreement. It required embodied moral will. The memories streamed back, not as orderly lessons, but as raw sensory inputs. Socrates' insistent gaze forcing him to confront his ignorance. The cold realization from the cave analogy that comfort often meant delusion. The powerful grounding derived from separating what was within his control, his own judgment and response, from the chaos of others. The failure he contemplated facing was not physical, but moral. It represented a regression, a slide back into merely repeating the accepted narratives, blame, assumption, self-pity. His learned philosophy seemed fragile against the sheer weight of human fallibility. He had understood that the good life required mastering the inner dialogue. Now, he faced an external stimulus, a trigger designed to provoke exactly those faulty judgments he had spent chapters correcting. If he acted from his old selves, he would prioritize emotional expediency over reasoned truth. If he succumbed, every lesson learned in Athens, the disciplined restraint, the relentless questioning, would feel utterly wasted. The moment became a crucible. The protagonist drew upon the synthesis of all previous teachings, the acceptance that ultimate freedom comes not from controlling outcomes, but from accepting the nature of uncertainty itself. The knowledge that virtue is an action guided by reason, not a mere state of being, and the understanding that profound wisdom requires courage, the courage to act rightly when it is emotionally difficult or socially inconvenient. He found himself moving through the situation with a deliberate slowness. Each step was weighed, each word considered, filtered through the sieve of his examined life. Instead of reacting instantly, he paused. He deliberately allowed space between the stimulus and the response. In that silent gap, the pure, rational faculty asserted itself. He began to see the people around him not as sources of conflict or disappointment, but merely as data points, as instances of humanity, flawed yet capable of change. The internal struggle was exhausting, a constant wrestling match between impulse and principle. It was an ongoing practice, a daily athletic endeavor for the soul. The true meaning of goodness, he realized now, was not finding a flawless answer or achieving a perfect state. It was maintaining that steady vigilance, the unending commitment to self-correction. The unexpected failure confirmed his understanding perfectly. He did not solve the problem by changing the external situation. He solved it by perfecting his own internal operating system. By refusing to be governed by transient emotions, he found a profound and quiet authority. This was the embodiment of ethical living, guided by reason. He understood that philosophy was not merely an intellectual pursuit for comfortable minds in the Athenian shade. It was gritty work. It was the discipline of remaining present, accountable, and measured, even when life demanded knee-jerk responses. The good life, therefore, is less a glorious summit to be reached, and more a sustained state of disciplined movement, a continuous engagement with one's own judgments. He walked away from that challenging moment not feeling triumphant or resolved in the absolute sense. He felt refined. He was perpetually undone by minor human errors and unexpected setbacks. But now, his reaction to those failures had changed fundamentally. Where once there would have been sharp anguish or defensive pride, there was instead a gentle return to self-reflection. What judgment did I make? Was that judgment rooted in fact or merely in fear? What wisdom can I glean from this discomfort? The unexamined life remains the greatest tragedy, but the practice of examination becomes the most profound freedom. The journey continues not with definitive answers, but with the quiet strength of continuous inquiry, forever committed to the self-correction that defines true humanity. This constant refinement is its own reward, a steady light guiding him forward in the perpetual dawn of self-knowledge. The hard-won understanding of the good life had stripped away all false certainties. The quest was no longer a race toward some perfect, tangible state, nor was it confined to a single answer delivered by a master sage. By confronting the deceptive allure of external success and the comfortable lies we tell ourselves, I had learned that true value resides in the architecture of the mind itself. Yet, as this profound clarity settled over me, I began to sense a subtle shift in perspective, a softening of the hard edges that rigorous self-examination sometimes imposes. The journey up the mountain of knowledge revealed both glittering prizes and daunting valleys. I had understood virtue as knowledge, and happiness as a byproduct of living rationally. But philosophy itself risks becoming an isolationist pursuit, a life spent perpetually arguing abstract points under the Athenian sun. Was the wisdom achieved meant only for contemplation? Could it truly integrate into the messy, vital rhythm of human existence? My initial understanding was one of discipline, constantly guarding my judgments and challenging assumptions. This discipline felt necessary, relentless even, a constant, intellectual siege against complacency. But I began to wonder if virtue could exist purely in isolation. Surely, a life dedicated only to the solitary pursuit of reason must eventually wither from lack of connection. The greatest lesson, I realized then, was not what I had gained through rigorous critique, but rather how that knowledge changed my relationship with other people, and indeed with wisdom itself. The true mastery lay not in possessing answers, but in cultivating a state of openness, a genuine friendship with the very process of inquiry. This friendship with wisdom is characterized by humility. It means recognizing that every time I think I have arrived at the definitive truth, there are layers of meaning waiting beneath it. Wisdom does not demand submission. Rather, it invites cooperation. It requires me to approach life not as a student seeking validation from an oracle, but as a curious participant in a grand ongoing dialogue. This shift was subtle yet monumental. I stopped viewing the pursuit of goodness as a singular objective, like climbing to the summit of Parnassus. Instead, I began seeing it as the continuous walk, the steady rhythm of footfalls and breath on any path. The good life became less about achieving perfection and more about maintaining an engaged state of awareness. It is the commitment to keeping my mind open enough to hear the quiet whispers of possibility, even when those whispers contradict established belief. The friendship with wisdom manifests in every interaction. When I listen to a flawed argument, I no longer feel the immediate sting of intellectual offense. Instead, I view it as valuable data, a chance to practice the Socratic method on another person's life. Their confusion becomes an opportunity for me to refine my own understanding, not through correction, but through gentle questioning. The wisdom gained also redefined what community means. It is not enough merely to live near other people. One must genuinely engage with their humanity. True philosophical friendship requires seeing past the polished masks of reputation and perceived status. It demands acknowledging the inherent value in every person's unpolished, lived experience, because those experiences are the raw material of truth. The discipline learned earlier, the separation of what is controllable from what is not, did not lead to emotional coldness. On the contrary, it created a profound reservoir of inner freedom. I realized that by accepting fate and circumstance with reasoned equanimity, I could devote all my energy to improving the quality of my own thoughts and actions. This radical acceptance provided the necessary ground for deep empathy. I understood then that philosophy is not an escape from life. It is the most intense way of living within it. It is realizing that the moments of profound connection, the quiet shared meal where real ideas are exchanged, or the simple act of witnessing a sunset without judgment, these small rituals become the highest forms of contemplation. They ground the lofty theories into tangible, breathable reality. Thus, the good life is not a static reward achieved upon retirement from learning. It is an active engagement. It is adopting the stance of an eternal student, always ready to admit ignorance, always prepared to be challenged, and always maintaining genuine curiosity regarding the complexities of human existence. It is cultivating that steady friendship with wisdom, a relationship built on mutual respect for the process, recognizing that the search itself is the purpose, and the journey is the ultimate reward. The goal shifts from defining goodness to being good in every moment, guided by an open heart and a disciplined mind. The journey of self-discovery has led us far from the polished marble and hurried debates of earlier chapters. We have wrestled with illusions, dismantled the comforting facades of external success, and learned that reputation or wealth can never fill the void at the core of being. The profound question, what is the meaning of a good life, has not been resolved by a single grand revelation, but through a long, arduous passage through self-doubt and reasoned questioning. The deepest realization now dawns with quiet certainty. The true reward was never finding a final definition, never achieving the perfect state of wisdom itself. Instead, the joy resides in the very act of asking better questions. It is found within the cycle of inquiry, the continuous commitment to improvement that defines a life lived thoughtfully. Consider the initial restlessness that first brought this quest into being. It was a feeling born of dissatisfaction, a sense that something vital, essential, remained elusive despite all the pleasures and achievements society offered. That initial frustration, once viewed as merely an obstacle, now transforms into the very fuel for existence. The restless mind is not necessarily flawed. Perhaps it is simply wired for truth. We have come to understand that life itself is a continuous conversation with oneself. Every morning presents us with a fresh set of choices and biases, requiring another round of gentle examination. This necessary introspection, this refusal to accept the surface explanation, becomes its own sustaining reward. It is a discipline far more valuable than any external prize. The temptation in times of intellectual struggle is always to seek closure, to reach a point where the questioning ceases, where the answer finally settles into comforting solidity. But we have learned through Socrates that such solid answers are often merely temporary shelters built upon shifting sand. The philosopher's life is not one of final settlements. It is one of continuous motion and reevaluation. The profound freedom arrives with the understanding that the journey, rather than the destination, holds all the meaning. To live well means accepting the perpetual student mindset. It means embracing the beginner's mind, recognizing that no matter how much knowledge you accumulate or how sure your convictions might feel today, tomorrow there will always be a more complex idea, a stranger's perspective, or an unexpected failure demanding new reflection. This shift in focus is deeply liberating when we cease to view wisdom as a possession, a finished product that can be owned and displayed, and instead see it as a metabolic process, an ongoing practice of refinement. The weight lifts from our shoulders. The goal changes from becoming wise to remaining attentive. This attentiveness is the quiet, profound joy we have uncovered. It is the genuine delight in engaging with humanity through inquiry. It is savoring the moment when a flawed assumption finally cracks under the pressure of careful thought. It is deriving satisfaction not from confirming one's own beliefs, but from discovering gaps in those beliefs. The struggle to define justice or courage was valuable not because we reached a consensus, but because the act of attempting consensus, the rigorous dialogue itself, forced us to look deeper into our inherent values. The process sharpened the mind and tempered the soul far more effectively than any single definitive conclusion ever could have done. Therefore, finding joy in inquiry means that every question asked is an affirmation of life. It reframes intellectual struggle from a difficulty to be overcome into a vital sustenance, the very breath that keeps the spirit awake and engaged. To ask why becomes the highest form of respect for one's own capacity for thought. This understanding acts as a powerful antidote to despair. When the world presents overwhelming suffering, or when personal failure strikes with brutal force, the mind can fall into bitterness or despair. But having cultivated this inner joy in inquiry, we recognize that even misfortune is merely data. It is an opportunity to refine our judgments, to test our ethical frameworks, and to ask, what does this event teach me about my own deepest values? The external struggle becomes internalized, transforming the wound into a teaching moment. To live well, then, is to commit faithfully to the self-examination, regardless of the immediate comfort or reward. It is accepting that one's intellectual life will be marked by doubt, curiosity, and relentless questioning. This commitment itself, the commitment to always remain open, always seek clarity, always question the comfortable assumption, becomes the most enduring definition of a meaningful existence. The path forward does not promise smooth sailing or ultimate certainty. It promises only depth, constant learning, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from being fully engaged in the bewildering, beautiful work of becoming better than one was yesterday. This tireless commitment to self-knowledge is the continuous source of joy, the unending fountainhead of a truly good life. The weight of years and profound learning rested upon him. He had walked the Athenian streets, not as a student merely seeking knowledge, but as a person fundamentally changed by questioning itself. The pursuit that began with simple questions about life's meaning had become a permanent state of being, a silent commitment to inquiry itself. He understood now that wisdom was less a destination to be reached and more the perpetual action of the journey. The echoing lessons from Socrates continued to resonate, not in grand pronouncements, but in moments of quiet clarity. Life demanded this new posture, the willingness to act correctly even when no one was watching, choosing the harder path aligned with reasoned virtue over the comfort of immediate impulse. This commitment required courage, not the physical bravery celebrated in myth, but the steady moral resolve to live according to truth, regardless of consequence or social pressure. The choice before him now mirrored this deepest understanding. It was a moment demanding not elaborate debate in the public square, but an internal arbitration. He faced a situation that held no easy answer and threatened to pull him back into the familiar vices of intellectual evasion or emotional reaction. His mind sifted through the accumulated wisdom, the recognition that external approval meant nothing, that wealth could buy only illusion, and that true value resided in the integrity of one's choices. He remembered the rigorous dismantling of assumptions, the painstaking work of defining courage and justice by systematically questioning everyone's comfortable certainties. That process had taught him that the mind was not a repository for facts, but a gymnasium for judgments. To be truly free, he realized, meant aligning his internal landscape with rational principle. This realization brought with it a profound form of restraint. The urge to argue passionately, to defend an intellectual position publicly, felt suddenly misplaced. True conviction was quiet. It resided in the disciplined silence that follows deep reflection, the silent commitment to doing what is right, simply because reason demands it. The temptation was immense to revert to old habits, to seek validation from a crowd of agreeing voices, or to justify his inaction by citing unpredictable circumstances outside his control. He had learned to distinguish between fate and judgment, the uncontrollable elements of life, the actions of others, the caprices of fortune, were simply data points for his rationality, never sources of personal distress or moral failure. Instead, he focused inward, finding stability in the rhythm of self-correction. His inner dialogue became steady, a constant check against flawed judgment. Every thought was filtered through the lens of virtue. Is this action rooted in desire, or is it rooted in understanding? Does this response come from fear, or does it spring from reasoned principle? The commitment he made in that moment was therefore silent. It was not a promise spoken aloud to others, but an unspoken pact with himself, a pledge to maintain the primacy of reason over emotion and custom. He accepted responsibility for his own inner life completely. This radical self-ownership was the highest form of freedom. To be free meant governing oneself from within, acknowledging that even in apparent failure or profound difficulty, one retains the sovereignty of judgment. The passage taught him that moral courage is not found when victory seems certain, but when the cost of virtue seems intolerably high. It requires accepting necessary burdens, the burden of constant scrutiny, the burden of knowing uncomfortable truths, and the burden of choosing correctly even when it means standing alone in philosophical conviction. This self-discipline, this dedication to living by internal ethical law, became his single most valuable possession. The weight lifted from him, replaced by a clear, centered quietude. The struggle was no longer about solving an ultimate puzzle. It was simply about maintaining the integrity of the inquiry itself. It was about remaining attentive, the constant state of being awake to one's judgments, ready to correct them, and willing to pay any price for that internal fidelity. His life became a continuous dialogue with his own conscience, guided by the relentless but gentle questioning inherited from Socrates. He understood that the meaning of a good life is not an answer you arrive at, but the disciplined way you maintain your capacity to ask questions, even when all the answers seem to be in sight. The stones of the Athenian street seemed to shift beneath his feet, but the familiar chaos of the city no longer threatened to unsettle him. He walked with a deliberate slowness, a rhythm that felt entirely new. The weight he had carried since those initial days, the burden of ceaseless questioning, the wrestling match with conflicting definitions, the sheer exhaustion of doubt, had finally lessened. It was not an escape from life's difficulties, for Athens remained vibrant and relentlessly demanding. Yet his steps were lighter, almost buoyant. He looked back at the plaza where he had begun this arduous journey, recalling the young man who had stood there, paralyzed by a single, overwhelming question. What is the meaning of a good life? That boy felt like someone from another lifetime, fragile and desperately seeking external validation. The knowledge gained through inquiry had stripped him bare. He understood that all the grand answers, the accumulation of wealth, the applause of the many, the attainment of high office, were temporary shields against the discomfort of self-reflection. They offered a momentary pleasure, yes, but they could never sustain the steady light of true contentment. The good life, he realized now with quiet certainty, was not something to be found or conquered in some distant market square. It resided quietly within the citadel of his own mind. The journey had been less about arriving at a perfect definition, and more about cultivating an irreversible discipline. He had learned that virtue was not merely knowing what is right, but practicing the relentless act of choosing what is right every single day, even when choosing it cost him comfort or praise. This realization provided a deep-seated resilience, transforming his former anxieties into focused resolve. He considered the lessons etched from Socrates himself, the necessity of acknowledging one's ignorance, for only by admitting lack can true learning begin. He had seen how comfortable assumed truths could be, and how easily they function as comforting illusions, shadows on a wall that are mistaken for solid reality. To live unexamined was to surrender his own soul to suggestion. The mind required constant attention, like an open flame needing continuous tending against the winds of popular opinion or fleeting passion. The understanding that success lay in mastering one's inner dialogue proved to be the most revolutionary concept of all. It shifted the battlefield entirely inward. External events, the fall of a market, a harsh word from a friend, a political setback, were not inherently good or bad. They were simply raw data. The judgment he applied to those events, the interpretation he built around them, was where his freedom lay. To correct that initial faulty judgment before allowing it to harden into an ingrained belief became the essence of self-mastery. This internal architecture allowed him a new perspective on conflict and failure. Where once he would have reacted with defensive anger or crippling shame, the knee-jerk responses of immaturity, he now observed. He separated what was genuinely within his power, his assent, his intention, his rational judgment, and he accepted everything else, the capriciousness of fate, the stubborn nature of others, the inevitability of loss, with a steady hand and an open mind. The concept that guided him onward was this radical separation. My duty is only to reason well, to be the custodian of my own inner life. This acceptance did not breed apathy. Rather, it liberated an immense energy previously spent bracing for impact. He faced the world now with a quiet dignity, understanding that his true worth was defined solely by the integrity of his mind and the virtue of his choices. He reflected on the beautiful difficulty of this philosophy. It required unending commitment. It demanded not just intellectual curiosity, but emotional grit. The good life was revealed to be an endless process of refining judgment, a perpetual return to reason's unwavering guidance. It was friendship with wisdom itself, adopting the student's stance even when seeming to possess knowledge, knowing that the most profound truth is always yet to be questioned. And so he continued his walk. He did not feel immune to struggle. Hardship still presented its sharp edges and unpredictable currents. But the internal compass spun true now. It was calibrated by reason, anchored by virtue, and fueled by the simple joy of inquiry itself. The burden was not gone entirely, but it had transformed. It was no longer a crushing weight of uncertainty or fear, but rather the light, manageable load of continuous self-improvement, the exhilarating effort of staying awake for one more night of thought. He walked forward, lightly burdened, finally at home within the disciplined landscape of his own rational soul. The journey does not conclude with a final answer. It is this realization that forms the core of true understanding. To think that wisdom could be captured in a single decree or achieved at a specific moment is itself an illusion, a comfortable settling into certainty. The seeds of genuine philosophical life are not planted and harvested. They require tending, day after day. I look back upon the questions posed in Athens. I recall the seductive nature of premature closure, the desire to simply label the good life with one clean word, virtue or perhaps excellence or maybe simple contentment. But Socrates taught me that such finality is impossible. The meaning of life resists being neatly packaged. It demands movement. It demands questioning. The deepest insight I carry now is this. The good life is not a discovery. It is an ongoing action. It is the commitment to remain perpetually in the state of studenthood, to accept that the very act of asking questions is more valuable than any answer found. This principle becomes the shield against the arrogance of knowledge and the enduring light of my spirit. This means acknowledging that every day brings a new curriculum. The self I knew yesterday has already begun to shift, refined by the sharp clarity of reasoned doubt. If I believe myself fully formed today, I am doomed to intellectual stagnation. Therefore, perpetual vigilance must become my habit. I must greet each sunrise not as a fresh start full of certainty, but as another opportunity for sincere inquiry. The promise of the eternal student is a commitment far heavier than any crown of laurels or weightier than the gold sought by fortune hunters. It is the choice to maintain intellectual humility even when I am certain. It means embracing my own capacity for error and viewing those errors not as moral failings, but as necessary data points leading toward a more accurate self-portrait. The wisdom acquired through dialogue, the grueling stripping away of assumptions about justice, courage, or the nature of the soul, has shown me that mastery is never complete. It is a dance with doubt itself. I learned to distrust my initial comfort and instead trust the disciplined process of reflection. When faced with temptation, whether it is the easy comfort of public approval or the dangerous allure of singular conviction, I must pause. The training dictates that I do not react based on emotion, nor do I act solely out of habit. Instead, I engage in an inner dialogue, a structured questioning of my own impulses and judgments. This process requires immense energy, a stamina more taxing than any physical journey through the agora. It is the daily effort to check my assumptions at the threshold of my own mind. To ask, why do I believe this? From what evidence has this conviction sprung? This questioning acts as an internal gatekeeper, preventing me from being misled by fleeting passions or cultural expectations. The true measure of a life, therefore, is not found in the trophies amassed or the compliments received, but in the purity and rigor of one's inner moral architecture. It is about maintaining congruence between what I profess to believe and how I choose to live when no one is watching, that silent commitment that only reason can maintain. I realize now that this journey connects all the threads: the self-examination taught by Socrates, the radical acceptance of external fate, the disciplined action in the face of difficulty. They are facets of a single life creed. The goal is not perfection, for perfection belongs to the gods, but rather continuous approximation toward virtue. It is living as if I have yet to understand everything, and therefore acting with the diligence of one who knows even less. The promise I make now, silently to myself and to this fleeting moment in Athens, is one of unwavering inquiry. To remain attentive, to continue questioning the boundaries between self and world, knowledge and ignorance. The great lesson is that life's deepest meaning resides not in knowing the answer, but in loving the unending quest for it. To live fully, responsibly, and eternally as a student of existence itself. The world around me continues, the vendors calling out, the sandals scuffing on the worn stones. But I walk through this bustling life with a profound lightness, no longer burdened by the need to define myself or my purpose with external accolades. My true self is now anchored within the gentle, persistent